Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. Beautiful night. I'm Roy Gutterman. I'm the director of the Tully Center for Free Speech, one of the co-sponsors of this event, and I want to thank you for coming out. I want to thank Andy Major and Amy Goodman for coming out. I'd like to thank Michelle from Hendricks Chapel and Audrey Burian, my assistant at the center, for making this event really come together smoothly. And you know, back in the summer, Andy from the Peace Council gave me a call and said, gee, we're thinking of bringing Amy Goodman up to campus and we're looking for some co-sponsors. And I had to think for about 2 seconds before I said, yeah, this would be a great event. Amy covers all the kinds of stories that mainstream media doesn't tend to want to cover, and the role of the independent press these days seems to be as important as it ever has been. And Amy's role in the Fourth Estate, the independent press, really plays in with what we advocate for at the Tully Center: free speech, free press, free flow of information, and free expression, all under the First Amendment. So I couldn't think of anyone better to talk about the role of the press and anyone else who's really putting the First Amendment to a real test more than Amy is these days. And Andy, I want to thank you for bringing her. Amy, I want to thank you. And Andy, thanks for coming.
Greetings, it's wonderful to see all of you here. My name is Andy Major. I'm one of the staff people at the Syracuse Peace Council. We gather here tonight on Onondaga territory, and the Peace Council wishes to express our appreciation for the legacy of peacemaking and environmental stewardship which the Onondaga developed in this beautiful region that we call our home. We also acknowledge the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, of which the Onondaga are the central firekeepers, as the world's oldest continuously operating democracy, formed over 1,000 years ago, right near here on the shores of Onondaga Lake. I'd like to thank Roy Gutterman and the Tully Center, as well as all of the other SU co-sponsors of tonight's event. If you look in your program, there's quite a lot of different departments and schools here at SU which are supporting tonight. Part of the reason for tonight is to celebrate the 75 years of activism of the Syracuse Peace Council. It's been 75 years, thousands of people, making us the oldest local independent peace and social justice group in the United States. We've had our times of success supporting the recognition of conscientious objectors in World War II, working with thousands and with millions of people around this country and around the world to end the Vietnam War after so many years of struggle, limiting the growth of nuclear power in this region of New York State, and more recently supporting the Onondaga Nation in their efforts for justice and environmental preservation. During those decades, we've also had a variety of frustrations and difficulties and struggles. We live in a nation that continues to invest heavily in war, to wage war in multiple parts of the globe, and to act as a global bully, with terrible consequences for people here in Syracuse, around our country, and around the world. So we have much work left to do. And that work has always been based in the idea that it's people like us, grassroots people, ordinary people, who can make a difference, who can make the changes that are so necessary to make democracy meaningful in this country. We hope that you'll consider joining that work if you're not already part of it. There's many ways to connect in with us. Inside of your program is an insert that talks about us and a way to get in touch with us, and there's also a table out in the lobby that'll be staffed after the program. Before I introduce Amy, I want to talk about one piece of our work, to stop the piloting of Reaper drones from right here in central New York. At the same time that we're gathering here tonight, there's a group of 38 conscientious citizens known as the Hancock Drone Resistors who are on trial in DeWitt Town Court, just a few miles from here. I got a text a little while ago from one of my colleagues there saying that former Attorney General Ramsey Clark was on the stand testifying as an expert witness, and that his testimony about the effect of these weapons was very, very powerful. So I hope that you'll follow that case and offer support as you're able. Now to introduce Amy Goodman. Amy is a beacon of light in what is really a desolate media landscape here in this country. The name of the show that she created, co-hosts, and is the executive producer of isn't just Democracy Now!, it's Democracy Now! With an exclamation point. It's a unique source of information and ideas, and equally important, a call to action to make the real promise of democracy in our nation a reality, a promise that has thus far gone unfulfilled in the 200+ years of our nation's existence. Amy is the recipient of many awards and accolades, some of which are listed in your program. But what makes Amy unique and so important to our nation is the people that she and her team at Democracy Now! Bring onto the air, and the cutting-edge role that Democracy Now! Plays in supporting and building the independent media movement that Roy talked about briefly earlier. You'll rarely hear people like Noam Chomsky, Arundhati Roy, the late Howard Zinn, Angela Davis, or other such voices in the mainstream corporate media. And you'll almost never hear the kind of grassroots activists from around the world who regularly appear on Democracy Now! People like our own Horace Campbell, professor of political science and African American studies here at Syracuse University. The people of the Occupy movement here on Wall Street and around the country, and scores of similar folks around the world. After you listen to Amy, I hope that you'll agree with us that Democracy Now! Ought to be part of the broadcast world here in Central New York, where the show currently is not available on radio. Please join me in welcoming Amy Goodman.
Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be here at Syracuse University with the Syracuse Peace Center. My colleagues are here, Nermeen Sheikh and Dina Guzder, who are both sitting here now, also thinking through how we're going to produce tomorrow's show, which we're going to be broadcasting from WCNY PBS here in Syracuse tomorrow morning. And I want to acknowledge Kwame Dixon, who's here, professor here at Syracuse University, also happens to be the husband of a former Democracy Now! Producer, Maria Carrion, who, was producing Democracy Now! Back in 2000, the day she came to help out just for a few days from Spain, when she had come back after being a producer for years, just to help out with that election day broadcast when George Bush and Al Gore were running for president. We figured she'd be there for that day and then she could fly out, but that day turned into 5 weeks before it was decided who would be the president of the United States. There is so much happening right now that needs a media that is fair, that is open, that is honest, to discuss the critical issues of the day. As Nermeen, Dina, and I were coming here from the airport and the hotel, we were speaking on Skype to our colleague on the Tahrir. That's the name of a Canadian ship that left an Eastern Mediterranean port just a day ago, actually a port in Turkey, and joined in the international waters an Irish ship. There are 6 activists on board the Canadian ship from the United States, from Canada, from Israel, Palestine, from Egypt, And from Australia, the Irish ship is filled with diplomats and activists, and they are yet another flotilla, this one called Freedom Waves to Gaza, that is attempting to make their way to Gaza and challenge the Israeli naval blockade. Jihan Hafetz is our correspondent on board this ship. She filed her report this morning. You can go online today, you can watch it, you can listen to it, you can read it as we post what is happening. But as we were coming here to Syracuse University, not clear who, but there were warships, warplanes that were circling. They left. There has been a boat that has been following them through the international waters. We're not sure who they are. And however you feel about this mission, that is up to you. But what's important is that you have the information so that you can make up your own mind. Now the international networks are calling us for clips of what we've been broadcasting. We've been there from the beginning, learning about this flotilla movement. Aaron Mate and Hani Massoud were there a few months ago covering the US ship, the Audacity of Hope, that was attempting to also be part of an international flotilla that the Greek government stopped. But we cover movements. We cover power. We cover movements because movements also have tremendous power. And that's our job. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and we debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country, like at Hancock, because they can't really have these debates on military bases. They rely on us and civilian society to have the discussions and the debates that will lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they are killed or kill. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. About 2 weeks ago, colleagues from Democracy Now! And I went down to the Occupy Wall Street encampment to hold a news conference about the settlement of a case that we brought several years ago against the Twin Cities Police and the Secret Service for their arrests of us, of Democracy Now! Reporters at the Republican Convention on September 1st, 2008. We were among well over 40 reporters who were arrested simply attempting to cover the protests outside the Republican Convention. Now, the Democratic Convention had occurred first in Denver, if you remember, and there were mass protests there, and we covered all of them. And then we flew to St. Paul. The first day of the convention was September 1st. It was a blue, clear sky day, and 10,000 people in the morning before the convention began at night were marching against war, led by soldiers, some in uniform, and they take great risk when they do this. Some who had gone to war and come back and felt it was wrong, others who were refusing to serve from the beginning. And thousands of civilians and people from every walk of life were there as well. And they walked from the St. Paul City Hall to the XL Center to express their views, and we were covering all of that. We would be doing daily 2-hour broadcast for that week of the convention as we had done the week before. Then I went off to the convention floor to begin our convention coverage. And I was interviewing delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. If you remember, that's when Sarah Palin had just been chosen as John McCain's vice presidential nominee and running mate. And then I got a call from Mike Burke, our senior producer, to come quickly to 7th and Jackson saying Sharif and Nicole have been arrested and they've been bloodied by the police. I was completely startled. They had gone off to the TV station to digitize tape. So we raced off to this corner of St. Paul. It was a big parking lot. I was with our cameraman at the time, who was Rick Rowley, a fantastic journalist who does big noise films. You should see his films with Jackie Suin, Zapatista, their films on Iraq, their films on the Battle of Seattle. One of the great journalists covering Iraq and Afghanistan just recently was in Somalia with Jeremy Scahill. So Rick and I raced down the streets to 7th and Jackson. I saw a riot police line. They had fully contained the area. There was really not many people around them. And I ran up. I was coming from the convention. I had my top security clearance credentials on, the credentials the authorities give me that allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents, delegates. And I raced up to the police line, and I quickly asked, could I speak to your commanding officer? We have 2 reporters inside. They have credentials like I have. I've just come from the convention floor. We need to have them released. It wasn't seconds before he ripped me through the line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, pushed me against the car, up against the wall, and onto the ground. I was pleading with him and the others that joined, don't arrest me, don't arrest me. We need to have our reporters released. I'm desperately looking for Nicole and Sharif because I knew they were not only arrested, but her. I couldn't find Nicole anywhere. This was Nicole Salazar, our multimedia producer, and Sharif Abdel-Quddus, our senior producer. You may know Sharif's reporting from Tahrir Square in Egypt, the remarkable reporting he did for those 18 days of the Egyptian revolution. He became one of the top tweeters in the world. I mean, Democracy Now! Began 15 years ago as the only daily election show in public broadcasting on a few dozen community radio stations. And then came the week of September 11th, 2001, and coincidentally we started broadcasting on one TV station, the public access station in New York, and we went on the day after the September 11th attacks as emergency broadcasts, and the show then just took off. The hunger for independent voices. Soon we were broadcasting on dozens of radio and TV stations, from Pacifica Radio to college and community stations, more and more NPR stations, public access TV stations, PBS stations. Now close to 1,000 stations are running us daily. The largest public television station, KQED in San Francisco, has just picked us up. And Sharif, flying in from New York almost directly into Tahrir. You know, because necessity is the mother invention, we didn't have the millions to pay for satellites as we grew, and didn't want to pay, for example, Saddam Hussein what CNN and the other networks paid, paying him the millions to use his satellites. We felt that was wrong, and so we had our reporters like Jeremy Scahill. He would go into an internet cafe, he would get through the Saddam's firewall by sending with a computer program, dividing video broadcasts into about 150 emails, like through your backdoor screen. And back in New York, we put them back together and we would broadcast perfect broadcast quality video reports. Now, in Tahrir, when Mubarak brought the internet down, Sharif had a joke. He said that was Mubarak's fatal error. He said, after all, we're Egyptian, we would have been inside, we would have been on Facebook, we would have been tweeting, but when he brought the internet down, we all had to go outside and see what was happening. And that was Tahrir Square. But actually, of course, it was so much more. If you watch or listen to Democracy Now!, you heard Asma Mahfouz last week. 26-year-old young female activist, one of the founders of the April 6th movement, who right before January 25th, the beginning of the uprising, which wasn't really the beginning, on January 18th, she posted on YouTube a video of herself that went viral. You know, her head was covered, but her face wasn't. She said her name. And she called on people. She said, particularly men, don't be cowards. You come to Tahrir on January 25th. And in this time when Mubarak had full control, how brave could one get? Hardly as brave as Asma Mahfouz. And the reason I saw her the other day is she came to Occupy Wall Street, to commune with the people there, to talk about the strategies and the tactics that they had used, and to marvel at what was taking place, not only in New York, but was taking place all over this country. You know, there are hundreds of pizza pies that are being sent in to occupy Wall Street, from the local pizzerias that get orders from people in Egypt and Madison and all over the world to send in to the occupiers near Wall Street. They call them occupies. And these residents of Zuccotti Park, of Liberty Square, are nothing if they are not resourceful. So they use every bit of what they get. They eat the pizza pie, but then they rip off the tops of the pizza boxes and they use them for signs. And oh, how brilliant they are. You know, this is not a recession, it's a robbery, is written on the back of one pizza sign, one pizza box. Another says, oh, just during that freak snowstorm. And when we talk about extreme weather, when we talk about severe weather, you know, in New York, this massive snowstorm that took place last Saturday, one of only 4 in the last 135 years in October. We got to tell the networks that flash severe weather and extreme weather, you know, it's not just about us putting on our boots and figuring out how heavy and how waterproof our clothes should be. We need to have another 2 words flashed at the same time. Global warming, global disruption, climate change, because there is something we can do about this. And so these pizza boxes, they cleared all the signs away in the middle of the snowstorm, and they just put up one: hell, snow, we won't go. But there are other signs. For example, one of them said, I'll believe a corporation is a person when Georgia executes one. I'll talk about that in a minute. But Sharif's reporting why he became one of the top tweeters in the world figured out a way around, well, the internet being down, of course. And then CNN and MSNBC and the networks were quoting him and interviewing him, as you had the network anchors like Anderson Cooper and others. When the thugs brought down the satellites, well, we use satellites too, but we also know how to do it down and dirty, how to get stuff through the internet. And so when the satellites went down but the internet was up, Sharif and Hani were sending 20, 25-minute reports through the internet, and you were meeting the voices, the faces, the people of Tahrir. Not just that extremely impressive bird's-eye view where you saw 1 million people in the square, but you met Ahadef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love. Her nephew right now has just been arrested, who blogs, who conveys information in this, what you can't really call post-revolutionary Egypt, because this is an ongoing process right now. You met Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old great Egyptian feminist. She had run for president. She was imprisoned under Sadat. She was exiled under Mubarak, still had such great hope, telling the young people, you will win. It was hard to believe she believed this. And the young high school student who was putting out a broadsheet, Voices of Tahrir, and she was doing this in the shadow of these mass buildings of state media. They could have been your family, your daughter, your uncle, your grandmother. That is the power of community media, bringing us the voices of your community. It reminds me always of how we got our start at Pacifica Radio. When I heard about the Syracuse Peace Council, it really made me think about similar beginnings. Pacifica began more than 60 years ago in Berkeley, California. A war resistor named Lou Hill, after World War II, came out of the detention camps and said, there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. Not run by corporations, as George Gerbner, founder of the Cultural Environment Movement, former dean at the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, said, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica Lupa was born, KPFA in Berkeley in '49, in 1959 KPFK in Los Angeles, our station in New York, WBAI 1960. In 1977 WPFW went on the air in Washington, but just before that, the 4th Pacifica station, altogether there are 5, KPFT went on the air in Houston in the Petro Metro. It went on the air for a few weeks, and it's the only radio station in the country that was blown up. The Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And when KPFT got back on their feet, the silver lining was they didn't have any money for advertising. This certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. When they got back on their feet, and I think were playing Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant, they blew it up again. I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear a high school student putting out her Voices of Tahrir, when you hear a Palestinian child, or an Israeli grandmother, or an uncle in Afghanistan, or an aunt in Iraq, you think that sounds like my bubba, my baby, my grandmother, my grandfather, and it breaks down stereotypes. Breaks down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. That's the power of media, of an honest, open media. The media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Sometimes I cough uncontrollably. If I do, just use the opportunity to stand up and stretch. And so it was that Sharif who later reported from Tahrir and brought us the human face of this revolution, who was in this parking lot the year before. And I couldn't find Nicole, but I saw Sharif across the parking lot, his hands behind his back, and I was demanding the police bring me to him. I was handcuffed, he was handcuffed. They finally brought me to him. We were standing there, we both had our credentials on, and we were demanding to be released, whereupon the Secret Service came over and they ripped the credentials from around our necks. They brought me into the police wagon. They charged me with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. There was a peace officer in the vicinity. And Nicole was in the police van. Her face was bloodied, she was handcuffed, and she quickly told me what had happened. She said, yes, they were digitizing tape in the TV studio, but they heard a commotion outside. So she grabbed her camera, and Sharif grabbed the microphone, and they raced downstairs. And there were protesters, there were riot police, there was this big parking lot. And Nicole just started filming, and then it was just her, basically, and the riot police coming at her, and she was up against the parked cars. And they were coming at her in full riot gear. And they were shouting, on your face, on your face. She was filming, and she was holding up her press pass, and she was shouting, press, press, as she was filming, not planning to film her own violent arrest. And before she knew it, she was down on the ground, and you may have seen the YouTube video of this arrest, screaming, press, press, as they took her down on her face, from behind and in front of her, knee or boot in her back, dragging on her legs so they're bloodying her face. And the first thing they do as her camera tumbles is take the battery out of her camera. If you're wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. Sharif is a very cool guy. He was telling the police to calm down. He was telling the rioting police to calm down. And they took him, threw him up against the wall, kicked him twice in the chest, bloodied his arm, and took him down. They were facing felony riot charges. So the police van takes me to the police garage where they've erected the protest cages to put the protesters in. And Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail. It was only because independent media put the YouTube video of our arrests up, my arrest and Nicole's arrest, within a half an hour. I think that we were freed within a number of hours. They got more than 10,000 calls, tweets, faxes, emails, the Twin City authorities to have us released, to show the power of it. Sharif was in a cell with the AP photographer. They released Sharif well before the AP photographer. So I'm brought then back to the convention center. The networks want to talk to me about what happened, and I'm in the NBC skybox, and I'm doing an interview. They end the interview, and the NBC reporter comes over and says, "I don't get it, why wasn't I arrested?" And I said, "Oh, were you covering the protests in the streets too?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, I'm not being arrested in the NBC skybox either." You see, like as Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You've got to get out there. You know, it's our job not just to cover what is happening on the convention floor, though that is important. It's also what is happening in the corporate suites, who's sponsoring the Republican Governors Association like the Koch brothers, who's sponsoring the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. You know, it's the basic tenets of good journalism. You follow the money. And we got to get out on the streets where the thousands of uninvited guests are, and they have something important to say as well. Democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. So the next day I went to Police Chief John Harrington's news conference, the St. Paul Police Chief, and the police officer who opened the door of the news conference happened to be my processing officer from the night before. And I said, "You not only have to let me into this news conference, you have to let me out when it's done." So the cameraman was there, all the camera people and the reporters, and I raised my hand. I described what happened to Nicole Sharif and to me, and I asked Police Chief Harrington, "How do you expect us to operate in this atmosphere? And what have you instructed your police to do?" He said that we could embed with a mobile field force. Embed, you know, with the police mobile field force. The next day I saw a Fox reporter in the middle of this moving police organism going through the streets. I know what embedding is about. You know how reporters embed in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not saying that those reporters aren't brave, but what are you getting from that perspective? You're sleeping with the soldiers, you're eating with them, your life is in their hands. You're covering the war from the trigger end. What about being embedded in Iraqi hospitals and Afghan communities and the peace movement around the world to understand the full effects of war? I think the embedding process, which, by the way, the Pentagon has called a spectacular success, I think that's just why it is a tremendous failure for the media. It has brought the media to an all-time low. We must be separate. And my brother David and I, one of our first book was called The Exception to the Rulers. That's what the media should be. Our second book is called Static. And the reason we call it that is in this high-tech digital age with high-definition radio and with high-definition television and digital radio, still, all we ever get is static, that veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Which is why we sued these Twin Cities police and the Secret Service. And just a few weeks ago, the magistrate judge in Minneapolis called all of the parties together. Sharif had to fly in from Egypt, Nicole from grad school. She's studying urban planning at MIT. I came in from New York and Democracy Now! The Secret Service were there, representatives of the US Attorney's Office, the police were there. And the question was, could we settle through the day? The police were adamant they didn't want to. But by the end of the day, we had a landmark settlement hammered out. a six-figure settlement, $100,000, which I think is a critical message that police around the country must hear, especially when dealing with these Occupy encampments, and especially as we move into the Republican Democratic conventions in Charlotte and Tampa, that they will have to pay a price for unlawful arrests and for arresting journalists. And most importantly, we want a concession from the St. Paul Police that they would develop, with our help and the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights who work with us in this lawsuit, and other organizations, a training guide for the police and how they deal with reporters that will then be presented to the Minneapolis police and the state troopers. And it is very unusual to win any concession or financial award from the Secret Service, which we did on that day, and went to Occupy Wall Street with our lawyers to announce this settlement. Because too many times we've heard at Occupy Wall Street, and we've seen it as we cover the protests that emanate from there, police officers telling people to turn off their video cameras. That's exactly when you must turn your video camera on. And good police know this. They know transparency is good. If you really want to maintain law and order, you must treat people fairly and uphold the law. Instead, what we've seen in New York in the last few weeks is more than 700 people arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge as they marched against global inequality, as they marched against corporate greed. 700 people arrested, among them reporters as well. This is one of the largest mass arrests in U.S. history. How many chief executive officers or executives of these corporations that have cost the American people so dearly, the record numbers of foreclosures, just the tip of the iceberg, have been arrested, even for disorderly conduct. Who, if we lived in a fair society, would be behind bars, and who would be free? If we lived in a just society, I don't know if we would have been down in Jackson, Georgia on September 21st, covering yet another execution in this country. How many of you heard the broadcast as we broadcast from the death row prison in Jackson, where 100 men sit on death row? Well, now 99. And there's one woman in Georgia, but she's not at that prison. We went on September 21st to Jackson to broadcast at the time that Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. Troy Anthony Davis, young African-American man, 1989, in a parking lot in Savannah, Georgia, a white, brave police officer in Savannah named Mark McPhail was moonlighting for Burger King as a security guard. A homeless man was being pistol whipped in a parking lot, and he went to save him, and he was shot, Mark McPhail. The question was, who murdered Mark McPhail? Troy Davis was charged with his murder. Since the trial and his conviction, where he was sentenced to death row, 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses recanted or changed their testimony, saying there was police coercion. One of the 2 who did not recant was named Sylvester Red Coles. Many others have pointed the finger at him, saying he was the shooter. He was the one who went with one of the fanciest lawyers in Savannah right after the murder to the police and pointed the finger at Troy Davis. He is the one that others have come forward, like close friends of his, and said that he admitted that he killed Mark McPhail. But it's Troy Davis who had been on death row for more than 20 years, more than half his life, who protested, who continually cited his innocence until the moment he took his last breath. Troy Anthony Davis, 2 Nobel Peace Prize laureates at least called for a stay of his execution. South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, former US President Jimmy Carter. The Pope called for a stay of his execution, as did the Republican former FBI Director William Sessions and the former Republican Georgia Congressmember Bob Barr. As did 5 former and current prison wardens, one of them the former warden at the death row prison. His name is Alan Alt. And he wrote a letter to Nathan Deal, the governor of Georgia, saying, do you know what the death penalty does to those who execute the people? Imagine you're a civil servant and you're told to kill someone tonight. Already, even if it's believed the person is guilty, post-traumatic stress disorder among those who do this is very high. But Alan Alt, the former warden who knew Troy Davis well, said, and then when you have a person like Troy Davis, with all of this doubt, he too called for a stay of his execution. Last March, the US Supreme Court ruled Davis should receive an evidentiary hearing. You see, there is no physical evidence that linked Davis to the murder. No DNA, no gun. One of the jurors, Brenda Forrest, said on CNN in 2009, all of the witnesses, they were able to ID him as the person who actually did it. Since the 7 witnesses recanted, she says, if I knew then what I knew now, Troy Davis would not be on death row. The verdict would have been not guilty. But Troy Davis had 3 major strikes against him. First, he is an African-American man. Second, the man he was convicted of killing was a white police officer, and actually the single determinant, most important determinant of how a person ends up on death row is the race of the victim. Third, Troy Davis lived in Georgia. More than a century ago, the legendary muckraking journalist Ida B. Wells risked her life when she began reporting on the epidemic of lynchings in the Deep South. She published Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases in 1892, and followed up with The Red Record in 1895, detailing hundreds of lynchings. She wrote, in Brooks County, Georgia, December 23rd, while this Christian country was preparing for Christmas celebration, 7 Negroes were lynched in 24 hours because they refused or were unable to tell the whereabouts of a colored man named Pike who killed a white man. Georgia heads the list of lynching states, she wrote more than a century ago. Well, when I wrote this piece, the planned execution of Davis would not be at the hands of an unruly mob, but in the sterile, fluorescently lit confines of Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Butts County, near the town of Jackson. The state was not intending to hang Troy Davis from a tree with a rope or a chain. But to hang as not to hang as Billie Holiday sang, like a strange fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. No, the state of Georgia would administer a lethal dose of pentobarbital. Georgia's using the new execution drug because the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration seized its supply of sodium thiopental last March, accusing the state of illegally importing the poison from the back of a driving school in London, England, that a couple was selling to death row prisons around the United States. Ben Jealous, president of the NAACP, said, "This is our justice system at its very worst." The question was, would the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles listen to Jimmy Carter or the Pope? Would the Board of Pardons and Paroles listen to South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu or William Sessions? Or would the board listen to the mobs who cheer for death? Do you remember the Republican debate when, I think it was Brian Williams, the NBC anchor, asked Rick Perry, the governor of Texas, about presiding over more than 200 executions, and before he said he was proud of this, what was a bit more chilling was the applause that went up in the audience that Brian Williams noted In America, we applaud death. And so we went down to this death row prison to bear witness, to be reporters, to see how does this happen. If I could have been in a death chamber with the camera, I would have been. Because I think it's absolutely critical that when we make decisions about public policy, we understand what is done in our name, no matter how gruesome the pictures are. We got as close as the grounds outside. 150 people were in a protest pen. That's all the Board of Corrections would allow on the grounds, and 1,000 people were across the street holding candles. Students marched from the traditionally black colleges of Spelman and Morehouse from Atlanta, 40 miles to the Georgia prison. How did it go down? In the afternoon, we went to a small church down the road from the prison. Troy Davis was being prepared for execution. And human rights leaders held their news conference. They spoke out. But before I went there, I got the press packet from the Board of Corrections. It was actually very thin. It mainly focused on what Troy Davis would be having for dinner. It gave great detail. Well, first it told its schedule. 9 to 3, he'd be meeting with family and friends. And at 3, they had to leave because he had to take a routine physical. Routine? Physical? Well, you know what has happened before. I think it was in Texas when a man on death row attempted to take his own life the day of his execution. They raced him to the hospital, they got him better, and then they executed him when he was better. They had to ensure that Troy Davis was healthy enough to be executed that night. The dinner, they said, he would have. He had refused getting a special meal. The prisoner can choose whatever he wants for his Last Supper. But he'd refused that, so he'd be given the standard prison meal tray, and it laid it out. Grilled cheeseburgers, not one, grilled cheeseburgers. Oven-roasted potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a great beverage. And then they gave us a piece of paper. There were just 4 lines, like written for a 5th grader, big words, like flashcards on one page. And it said, pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, in parentheses, a sedative. This would be the lethal cocktail that he would wash down his meal with. The pentobarbital anesthetizes. The pancuronium bromide paralyzes. The potassium chloride stops the heart. The choice the prisoner has is to take the sedative an hour before and to have the last meal. He declined both. And so the people gathered on the grounds, and they waited to hear if there would be a stay of execution. We began our broadcast at 6 o'clock. 7 o'clock was the appointed hour, but it looked like there might be some kind of reprieve. People jumped for joy on top of each other, hugging each other. This would be the 4th death warrant that Troy Davis had survived. But then they realized they just had wrong information. The Supreme Court, well, the point person on the Supreme Court was Clarence Thomas from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves not far from Savannah. And Clarence Thomas had this for a few hours, and then we got word at about 10:53 that Troy Davis would not be granted a stay. And the execution began. He's laid out on a cross. His arms are laid out in the death chamber, and they put the needle in his arm, and they inject the cocktail. The people in the death chamber were the McPhail family, 4 reporters, and 2 lawyers and friends of Troy Davis. It was announced at 11:08 that Troy Davis was dead. The reporters came out to report his last words. And they described Troy Davis looking over directly at the McPhails, the officer's son, Mark McPhail, and the officer's brother. Troy Davis said to the McPhail family that he was innocent, that he did not kill their father, their brother, their husband. And he turned to the lawyers, his friends, and told his family to keep up the fight. And then he told the people who were executing him, God have mercy on your souls. God bless your souls. He died at 11:08. They sent in an ambulance to a hearse to take him to Atlanta for an autopsy. On the death certificate, it's listed homicide. The family has to pay for transporting the body. And at about 11:45, as we were finishing up the broadcast, as the last eyewitnesses came out, the Department of Corrections, press people, and guards came out and told us that we'd have to end the broadcast right then. They were pulling the plug on the broadcast. The show was over. And I could only think, as this day ended, as the life of Troy Davis was ended by the state of Georgia, I could only think of the words of Mahatma Gandhi when asked, what does he think of Western civilization? He said, I think it would be a good idea. But coming here to Syracuse, to this historic area, learning about what took place in 1851, for example, the Jerry Rescue, and there's a monument downtown I hope to see before we leave, this hotbed of abolitionist activism, people saying no to the Fugitive Slave Act, that they would free those who were enslaved who came to Syracuse. It makes me think about the importance of movements. And it makes me think about what's happening in this country today. You know, on Election Day 2008, I think the whole world heaved a sigh of relief when Barack Obama was elected president. Republican, Democrat, American, non-American. For so long, people had hit their heads against a brick wall. They felt perhaps that wall had become a door, and the door had opened a crack, and the question was, would it be kicked open or slammed shut? And that's up to more than one person, because after all, the community organizer-in-chief became the commander-in-chief. And what does that mean for movements? It's a very profound question. I mean, the fact that Barack Obama was a community organizer, and just think parents all over this country are saying to their kids, maybe you could be a community organizer too. That's a very good thing. But what does it mean when he becomes commander-in-chief? People who did vote for him, the masses, the millions of young people who turned out, the people who were disenfranchised before, who never bothered to vote, who turned out. Suddenly they saw this right-wing backlash. They didn't want to contribute to it, but they also saw that the person who they had such high hopes in. I mean, I think the anti-war movement helped to elect Barack Obama. What was the only difference, almost, between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton? Barack Obama had been against the Iraq War, and Hillary Clinton had voted to authorize it as senator and hung on to her rationale until, well, almost the bitter end, when she realized she was losing on this point and finally said maybe it was a mistake. And yet the anti-war movement that helped to elect Barack Obama then went on to see that the war in Afghanistan, the longest war in US history, had become Obama's war, had become Obama's surge. The drone attacks that people are just down the road right now on trial for at the Hancock base, that these were intensifying under President Obama, the man they had elected, perhaps you had elected. That the person who one of the first acts in office had announced Guantanamo would be closed within a year, it hasn't been closed. That the man who talked about the importance of immigration reform, and now more immigrants have been deported under the Obama administration than under any president in history. Certainly well more than President Bush ever dared to have deported. When I say ever dared, because he knew the backlash that he would face. from people who then went on to elect President Obama. And now what do they do when this president, who they elected, don't carry out their wishes? Well, there is a force more powerful than the most powerful person on earth. And that force is all of you, is people, is movements. It always has, it always will be. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Frederick Douglass, the power of these movements and where we stand today. You know, when President Obama sits in the Oval Office and those who are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth whisper in his ear and make their demands, if he can't point out the window of the Oval Office and say, if we do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, he's in big trouble. Sometimes he may need people to be out there to push forward on a plan he supports, and many other times he may not agree with you at all, but that does not determine movements. What determines movements is what you see, the reality on the ground, and what you want to do about it. And I think that's why we're seeing these Occupy encampments all over the country and all over the world. But when when Senator Obama was elected president before he was inaugurated, I was invited on CNN the day that the Obamas went into the White House, remember when they were meeting the Bushes for the first time, to talk about the significance of this moment. So I was in the studio and the hosts were chattering about something, and I'm watching the Obamas walk into the White House on the video screen, and they asked me about something else. I said, no, we have to take pause. This is an historic moment, right? Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama. She is the descendant of slaves, so their daughters, Sasha and Malia, are the descendants of slaves. They are walking into the White House, the most famous house on earth, where they will soon reside, which was built by slaves. This is an historic moment. We must take pause. And I thought about a house not so far from the White House, a couple of hours away on the eastern shore of Maryland. This is the story of Frederick Douglass. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. It might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. So he was handed over to a slave breaker, a man named Ed Covey. His property was called Mount Misery, and that's where Frederick Douglass was brought, where he was tortured, where he was beaten, and Frederick Douglass fought back, and he headed north, and he changed the world. That property today, Mount Misery, is owned by Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it in 2003 to be his vacation home. It's in St. Michael's, Maryland. And when I heard that story, I was surprised. And I did a lot of internet research. Could this be true? And I thought, well, you know, as a journalist, I really have to investigate this. I have to see this with my own eyes. And so my colleague Dennis Moynihan and I headed down to St. Michael's, Maryland. And I realized when we got there, I had no idea where Donald Rumsfeld lived. But in New York, I go to this coffee shop in Lower Manhattan, this wonderful old brick building, and there's a plaque outside that says, "This was the printing press of David Ruggles, born a free black man in Connecticut. And when Frederick Douglass came north, he took refuge here." You know, Frederick Douglass started the North Star newspaper. David Ruggles had this printing press. These men saw media as their form of liberation, because information is power. And so being down in St. Michael's, I see this coffee shop ahead of me, trying to figure out where am I going to find Donald Rumsfeld's house, and I think, oh, a coffee shop. You see a theme in my life. And it was an organic coffee shop, so I thought they'll tell the truth. So I went inside, and they said, "What would you like?" I said, "I'd like to know where Donald Rumsfeld lives." And they said, "Oh, you just go out back, you drive down the road, you'll hit Mount Pleasant Road, don't go down that road, you make a right and another right, and then you go to the end of the road, that's Mount Misery Road, and Donald Rumsfeld lives at the end of it." So we drove down the road. We didn't go down Mount Pleasant Road. We made a right and another right. It seems we couldn't go right enough. And we went down that road, and there we saw the black SUV with the black tinted windows of the Secret Service, and we knew we had arrived. So I got out quickly, and I took out my video camera, and I was zooming in as they were zooming out. And I'm thinking, does Donald Rumsfeld understand the significance of this historic place? But sure enough, as I'm zooming in with my video camera, I see a stake in the ground right next to the driveway that says Mount Misery. We head off to this ancient black church down the road. It was Sunday morning down an old dirt road. And I went into the sanctuary. The older folks were having Sunday school there, and I asked them, and I said, I have to ask, what do you think of this historic place where you live? I mean, you have Mount Misery where Frederick Douglass was tortured and beaten, and now Mount Misery is owned by Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who's known for torture. What do you make of this? And she said, I can't comment right now, we're in church. Well, from Mount Misery to Mount Hope. I was recently speaking in Geneva, New York, and a young woman came up to me at the end of the talk, and she said, would you come with me to Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, right, not far from here? She said, I want to show you the tombstone of Frederick Douglass. And I had to leave the next morning. It was a snowstorm, 5 in the morning, heading off to Denver. And I said, I really should please. I said, okay, if you'll meet me before 5 at the cemetery. So we went to Mount Hope, and she was standing under the snowflakes. And we went to the tombstone and brushed off the snow. And there was the grave of Frederick Douglass. And then she had a twinkle in her eye, and she said, please come with me across the cemetery. I want to show you one more grave. I said, oh my God, I'm going to miss it. Please, she said. So we ran across the cemetery, and there was a smaller grave with a smaller tombstone, a smaller marker of Susan B. Anthony, who's buried next to her sister. And when I told the story at Wesleyan College, a woman came up to me and said, did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house? Because right near it is a statue, not of a general, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. See, Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragist, the great feminist, the great women's rights activist, was not just a feminist and suffragist and great women's rights activist, but an abolitionist as well. And Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist of all time, was also a great supporter of women's rights. It was he who seconded the resolution at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention of 1848 for women to have the right to vote before many women supported this. The women's rights movement, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, these are the movements that have made this country great. And so I raced off to the airport and missed my plane. So I called up Dennis and said, I got to get to Denver, they're going to kill me. And he brings up the blueprints of the Rochester airport on his computer, and he says, are you in the Susan B. Anthony terminal or the Frederick Douglass terminal? I said, oh, please, this is no time for jokes. I've got to get on the next plane. He said, I'm not kidding. And all of a sudden I saw, as I'm standing helpless in this airport, there it was. There were the words, Frederick Douglass. I hadn't even seen them. And in the other wing, Susan B. Anthony. Every once in a while, you have to stop and smell the coffee. But these movements, how important they are what determine history. Rosa Parks, why it's relevant to talk about Rosa Parks today with the Occupy movement. You know how brave she was when she did what she did December 1st, 1955, right? Sat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to get up for a white passenger, and she launches the modern-day civil rights movement 4 days later, December 5th. She's in court. The Montgomery Improvement Association has its movement to elect its leader to lead the bus boycott that'll lead to the desegregation of transportation in the South, and they choose as their leader a young minister who had just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks helped to launch Martin Luther King. When she died a few years ago, Democracy Now! Raced down to Washington. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, then brought to a Washington church before the big funeral in Detroit. Thousands came out just for the memorial service. Oprah was inside. Cicely Tyson was inside. Hundreds of people were outside, big loudspeakers. We were outside where it's often more interesting to be, and I interviewed a young woman student. I said, "Why are you here?" And she said, "Oh, I emailed my professors this morning. I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education." And if there are any students here, you cannot quote me on that. But I do look forward to seeing you tomorrow at Syracuse University, because we're going to be talking to students about 10:30. Rosa Parks. When the media covered Rosa Parks' death and her life, they got it wrong. Oh, they said she was a great civil rights leader, and that was true, but they said she was a tired seamstress when she sat down on the bus. They said she was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. Rosa Parks knew exactly what she was doing when she sat down on the bus. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon, who came out of radical labor politics, who was the president of the NAACP. They've been challenging the racist laws of the South for years. Rosa trained at the Highlander Center, where Dr. King had been as well, black and white together, working to change the race laws in the South, to most effectively strategize to do this. She had sat down on the bus many times before and refused to get up, as did other young women. But this was the magic moment. And you never know when that magic moment will come. I mean, think about the Occupy movement. Do you know the number of older union leaders who are scratching their heads? I went to the mass union rally a few weeks ago, where all the union presidents in New York spoke at Foley Square. One of them had been in Tunisia and had gotten calls, said, "You're not going to believe this Occupy movement." They had held a rally in Washington last year, 100,000 strong. They hardly got any coverage. And they're saying, what is this movement that is ripping like wildfire through this country, whose principles they too believed in? And they said they didn't want to co-opt the movement, but they definitely wanted to support it. You never know when that moment will come. But when you're involved in social change, you help to determine history. You lay the foundation. You do determine the future. And I think that is what we are seeing today. And the number of people I've seen down at Occupy Wall Street who've come to visit. Just the other day, John Carlos. Do you remember John Carlos, 1968? There it is, the Black Power fist. The most famous, iconic sports moment in sports history. Mexico City, the Olympics. John Carlos got the bronze medal in the 200-meter dash. Tommy Smith he won. He got the gold. They actually were part of an Olympic Committee for Human Rights. They had been talking with Dr. Martin Luther King. This was 1968, about boycotting the Olympics. But then John Carlos, and we just had him on Democracy Now!, and I hope everyone reads the John Carlos story. He wrote it with a great sports writer, Dave Zirin. It's just out, and it's a wonderful account of his life. Again, you never know when this moment will come. They were going to boycott, and Dr. King was supporting them. Dr. King was assassinated, you may remember, April 4th, 1968. The Olympics were that summer. Not 2 weeks before the Olympics began in Mexico City was the Tlatelolco massacre, autonomous university in Mexico City. We don't still know how many, was it hundreds of students were killed, but John Carlos knew when he flew into Mexico City, and Tommy Smith knew too, about what was happening in the United States and what was happening in Mexico. They decided they would run, but they would use their moment in the sun to change the world, and that's what they did. So with the gold medal and with the bronze medal, well, they were about to get it. They walked out onto the medal stand after they won their race. With Peter Norman there, he took second. He was white, he was an Australian. And you remember that moment with John Carlos and Tommy Smith when they put up their hands, each one with a black glove and the Black Power salute as the Star-Spangled Banner played. You might wonder why one had a right glove and one had a left glove, because they actually had not exactly planned to do this. And they only had one pair of gloves. In fact, Peter Norman, who was the white second place runner, he wanted to wear a glove too in support of them, but they didn't have a third one. And so he settled for the button, and he paid a price for this when he came home to Australia, as did John Carlos and Tommy Smith. The difficulty they had in getting jobs, the difficulty they had in their families, the death threats, but they did what they did, and they didn't just put up their hands in the power salute. John Carlos wore beads to protest lynching, and they both rolled up their pants and they took off their shoes on the medal stand. They were wearing black socks to protest the poverty of black children in the United States, and John Carlos had zipped up his jacket, which you weren't supposed to do over an Olympic jersey, but he wanted to identify with the working men and women of the United States. And that is that image that so many people know today. And John Carlos told an amazing story, and a few nights ago I had dinner with Robert King Wilkerson. You might know who he was, in solitary confinement for 39 years at Angola prison in Louisiana. I just saw him in New York. He was one of those who carved the monument to John Carlos and Tommy Smith at San Jose State. But this is the story John Carlos told. They wanted to make this big monument for them at San Jose State, and he went there and they showed him the model, and they were starting to carve the stone. And he said, "No, I won't be any part of this." And the president of the university said, "What are you talking about? We're moving forward on this. This is such a big deal. They commissioned a great artist." And he said, "Where's Peter Norman?" And they said, "No, this is you and Tommy." He said, "No, only if all three of us are there, because Peter Norman was a critical part of what we did that day." And they said, "He doesn't want to be a part of it." He said, "I don't believe you." And he went into the president's office. They said, "Okay, call him. We got to build this monument." And he called him. He said, "Peter, what's going on? Why aren't you on this medal stand that's being remembered for all time?" He said, "No, this is your moment." He said, "But you can do something for me." And he said, "What's that?" He said, "Leave a space where I stood. And you could have a plaque right there if you want that says my name. But make sure you leave a space so that everyone who comes to see this monument can stand in my place and they can take pictures." And so that's what the monument is today. For John Carlos and Tommy Smith, Peter Norman has since died, and it represents not only the three of them in that moment, looking ahead, but everyone who comes to honor them. John Carlos was honoring the young people at Occupy Wall Street, saying, "You are carrying on the torch." And Jesse Jackson went there the other night, and he joined arms with young people at the first aid tent because he thought the police were moving in. Jesse Jackson, who was there on April 4th, 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated, you know, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. This past few weeks, the monument to Dr. King was dedicated in Washington, and President Obama dedicated that monument. Just down the road in front of the Supreme Court, Cornel West was getting arrested. And Cornel West said, as he was getting arrested with a number of other people protesting the level of corruption, that money, the level protesting what money has done to politics in this country, swamping politics, drowning democracy, said if the monument to Dr. King is being dedicated today, I think there's no place that Dr. King would rather be than with me on the steps of the Supreme Court getting arrested. He said, someone has got to get arrested today. These movements and these moments. When President Obama was running for president, he was in the backyard of a Montclair, New Jersey house speaking to about 100 people. It wasn't clear he would be elected at that time. And at the end of an evening, someone raised their hand just as he was leaving, and he asked Senator Obama, "What will you do about the Middle East?" And President Obama, Senator Obama, told the story of A. Philip Randolph. the greatest organizer of the 20th century, organized the 1963 March on Washington, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. A. Philip Randolph met with FDR, was brought there by Eleanor Roosevelt, and told FDR about the condition of black people in this country and working people in this country. And the story goes, and Senator Obama told the story to the group, that FDR listened intently, and when A. Philip Randolph was done, he said, "I don't disagree with anything you've said, but you have to make me do it." That's what Obama said to the person who asked about policy in the Middle East. He said, "Make me do it." That is the challenge today. That's how democracy operates. And first and foremost, we need a media that provides a forum to speak to, for people to speak to each other. And I just want to end with this story, this image. The last week of the Egyptian revolution, right before Mubarak fell, we heard that a young man named Karim Amr, a young blogger who'd been imprisoned under Mubarak for 4 years, had disappeared from Tahrir. We started to look for his blog, look for any evidence of where he was. It ended up he had been put in a desert jail. But when we found his blog, it said across the top, "This is dedicated to Hans and Sophie Scholl." I don't know how many of you know who Hans and Sophie Scholl are, but they were that brother and sister in World War II who formed with their professor and other students and workers the White Rose Collective. They were not Jewish, they were German Christians. They thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? They thought the best they could do was get out information so that the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And so they published a series of 6 pamphlets. Across the 4th pamphlet was written the words, "We will not be silent." They had these pamphlets dropped everywhere. In the middle of the night, in a courtyard, in a market, in the middle of a classroom, in a back alley, everywhere they could, people all over Germany. Well, Hans and Sophie were captured by the Nazis, as was their professor. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!
It's not so often that we go to hear someone speak and not only are educated and learn, but also are challenged. And I think Amy has very much challenged us to look at what our role is in democracy. Hopefully she's challenged those of you who are journalism students to think about your direction and your future and how you engage in your career, but she's also challenged all of us. Rather than doing a Q&A, Amy's happy to talk to folks out in the lobby. There are copies of her latest book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, for sale. She'll sign them for you. She's happy to talk to you even if you don't buy a book. So please check out the other tables in the lobby. As Amy mentioned, tomorrow morning, Democracy Now! Will broadcast from the nearby studios of WCNY in Liverpool. And the show will feature Central New Yorkers talking about the drones and the effort to stop the drones here. They'll talk about hydrofracking. People from afar will talk about Gaza. Although you can't catch it on your radio dial here in Central New York, it's available as a live stream at democracynow.org, and all of their shows are archived for listening at your pleasure. You can also watch Democracy Now! On the Dish Network and DirecTV satellite systems, and locally it airs a brief bit of it every Saturday on Time Warner's channel 98 from 9 to 11 on Saturday mornings. So again, we invite you to join with us at the Peace Council, and particularly if any of you are moved to help us get Democracy Now! On the air here, please talk to us at the table in the back or contact us via the web or in our office. So thank you very much for coming, and peace be with you.